Hi, my name is Dan Strobel. I am an Asia Pacific Leadership Fellow at the EastWestCenter in Honolulu, Hawaii, where we've been studying topics of leadership in the Asia Pacific. For the past 4 months, I've been traveling through Southeast Asia on a program called Guided Independent Study Travel, also known as GIST, researching a topic self-proposed and self-designed. I'm looking at the future of leadership in climate change. The purpose of my research began to better understand the issues in Southeast Asia stemming from climate change in 3 different locations that I traveled to. Those locations ended up being Nepal, the Philippines, and Thailand. The project began just so that way I could better understand the issue of climate change and see what people were doing in this region to identify problems stemming from it and look at the leadership aspects of that. Over time, I realized that instead of looking at the technical challenges that these countries faced, I became more interested in leadership aspects. So, my takeaway is that climate change in itself is a truly global issue. There is not a single human being on this planet or ecosystem that is not going to be impacted or that is not already being impacted by climate change. And talking with people in this field, I find that new systems of leadership need to be created and addressed to focus our efforts in a more efficient and impactful way, so that way we can, for the first time as a species, as a planet, deal with this global issue. So 2 of my takeaways from my research ended up being regional integration in combating climate change issues is key. Too many projects are being done individually or without any knowledge of what's happening even in the neighboring counties, let alone the neighboring countries or in the region. So projects end up tripping over themselves. And so we need to clean that up. We need to focus our efforts and our resources, the limited resources that we have, in more strategic ways. The second is educating and empowering general population to give them more ownership of this problem, so that way they feel empowered to make a difference, especially in Asia Pacific, where leadership is usually from the top down. So, I will go with 2 examples to highlight how I came to these conclusions. The first was when I was in Nepal. Talking with people there, I came to see the difficulty. Nepal is considered the 3rd most vulnerable place on the planet to climate change outside of the Arctic and Antarctica, where warming temperatures are decimating their water supplies, especially in the higher Himalaya mountains. So talking with people in the field gave me a hands-on view of the problems being faced and the lack of communication among organizations. Nepal is also an interesting case study in that it is water rich, which in a lot of places facing climate change, that is a challenge. But for them, because of the high mountains, the snow melts and the glacial lakes, they are able to claim a rich resource of water. Secondly, they also have just come out of a prolonged insurgency, basically a civil war, and their government is tenuous at best on what it can achieve. And so talking with somebody at an institute called IDE, who implements village-based projects for clean energy and development, it became a very interesting case study in that when asking about the future impacts of the government in coordinating and setting up a countrywide plan, pessimism started seeping through. Basically, right now the government is barely functioning in what we would consider a cohesive manner. They're still trying to implement a new constitution and work out among the various parties who has what power. So talking to different people, there was different ideas about when the government would be able to function enough to help create an integrative plan. And on the low end was 10 years from now, they might be able to have a plan in place and be implementing that. But that was a rough estimate, and many people believed it would take even longer. It could be even 10 years before the government itself was stable enough that they could try, and they were looking at a 20-year plan. And an issue like climate change, where every year we are changing the climate, 20 years waiting for a country to do a plan is a little too long, and people on the ground know this and are losing confidence in the ability of the government to be a sustaining factor. So they go elsewhere. But other factors have different incentives. And so there's kind of like what we view in the United States, a gold rush. People just coming in and there is no structure. Secondly, Nepal is a very tiny country with very low emissions in terms of the global scale of greenhouse gas emissions. But they are bounded on the north by China and India in the south, who are larger producers by far. So it also highlights the problem of a purely nation-state solution to global warming, in that Nepal could clean up its act tomorrow, but it will make very little difference in terms of the overall global impact of climate change if it cannot get its neighbors, China and India, and the other countries around it, to follow suit. So that highlights not only the piecemeal aspect inside countries, but then also the very different approaches that each country, even next to each other, take in fighting climate change. So how can we do this regional integration? The second story is from the Philippines, where I also highlight the disconnect between the populace and the governmental strategy. The Philippines Council of Governors did a plan where they looked at the impact of climate change on their archipelago. Unlike Nepal, who is facing water shortages due to higher temperatures in their climate and snow melts, where in 10 years' time they may be looking at drastically reduced glacier lakes and snow caps, the Philippines are looking at a rise in sea level, threatening their islands. And one example is the worst case scenario is a 2-meter rise in sea levels over the next 100 years. And this came from government ministers that I talked to that were part of the Council of Governors. And looking at Philippines, Manila is in the top 5 places that is going to be directly affected by sea level rise. And even looking at a 1.5 meter rise in sea level, about 2/3 of Manila will be underwater. It's also interesting to note that in Southeast Asia alone, out of the top 10 cities going to be affected by climate change, over half of them are found in Southeast Asia because they are at low-lying areas in the subcontinent. So looking at the Philippines story, you have the government that is acutely aware of the issues that are going to be happening, but an inability of the government to implement any plan. And that is not in itself a bad thing. It just shows that we don't know how to deal with it. What is troubling is when you talk to the people, the general populace. I had a chance to interview people, regular Filipinos, some that are working in the climate change sector, some that are doing various jobs. They're all acutely aware of climate change and the risks involved. In fact, most of them know about the fact that Manila and some of the other islands will submerge. But there's a powerlessness. One man I talked about with me for a long time about the science of climate change. He was very proud that he was helping his son study these issues, and that was his bonding time with his son. After long days of work, he would go and educate himself on these issues so he could help teach his son and help him in school and give him a better future. But when I asked him kind of what he thought could be done, the answer was, I don't know, that's for other people to decide. And I got that answer a lot, in that the general populace is waiting for the government to tell them what to do. But how there's a disconnect there if people do not believe in their government. The biggest source of frustration among the populace with the Filipino government is corruption. They believe that their government is corrupt, things aren't happening, money is not being spent, and so that way, and that the government itself is not going to do anything on these issues because they can't. Too much money is diverted to corruption. So how do you bridge that gap between the populace knowing about these issues but waiting for a government to tell them what to do, and the underlying pessimism, kind of like Nepal, where you don't actually believe the government can do anything, which basically leads to people just waiting and not doing anything. And so that highlights the other leadership issue, empowerment of the people to take on these challenges. Most of the work in climate change will not be done by governments. Governments and businesses and NGOs form public-private partnerships to tackle larger issues, maybe policy, maybe regional integration of systems. But it's going to be the general people that are going to change their incentives, their way of life. They're going to be the ones working to implement these changes. And the third aspect of this is also, right now, most climate change models focus on two aspects: adaptation of societies to change norms because of climate change, and mitigation, where people are cutting their emission standards on an annual basis to bring that down enough that the natural systems can take over. However, to keep a 200-year-long process from occurring to clean up our atmosphere, our population is not going to go down drastically in the next 100 years. We are always going to be emitting, so we need a third way, and that is active reduction, not just cutting our methods of producing greenhouse gas, but going into a negative quota to actually start cleaning up the environment proactively. And to do that on a global scale requires the general populace, not just government leaders. So part of the leadership, the new leadership, is how do we bridge the gap from a feeling of powerlessness among the general populace and governments that know of the issues but can't quite seem to put into practice, to having them work together, having a populace that feels empowered and a government responsive to those actions. So, and then the third place I went to was Thailand, looking at the regional issues, where again we saw this example with people I met that were focusing on the Mekong Delta and all the issues that this river that crosses through 5 countries deals with in terms of pollution, utilization for agriculture, fishing, hydroelectric power, and trying to get just 5 countries to agree on how to use this water source, because what happens in one country goes downstream and affects all the others. And just trying to get those 5 countries to work together on a unified plan has been very difficult. And so that's where I come back to new forms of leadership need to be addressed for this global issue. This is actually our first global issue. And we think of it in that term, but we resort to our old methods of how to deal with it, which are very regional, very country-specific, even down to the county, and we divide each other instead of working together. So the conclusion is, there is hope in this process. This problem, climate change, is human-made, which means that as humans, we can fix this. This is not a natural occurrence. So we just need to adapt and use new forms of leadership. One of that being the utilization of futures modeling, getting people to bridge the divide between present incentives, or the idea that they can't do anything, and future models. Where do they want to get to? And have that conversation open up and really start working on those issues that have been dividing us, and get people to jump over that divide and start working together. Other methods, which you can hear in some of the other videos, about design thinking. If we can start from the beginning of the problem and work through, we can come up with more efficient and more strategic plans so we don't waste the resources on problems and technologies or strategies that are going at cross purposes with each other. So the new form of leadership will look at the community level, which is being done, but will bridge the gap between communities. It will not just be community specific, but helping educate community leaders and the people in those communities so that way they can also understand what's happening in the communities next to them and what's happening in their region around them, to make sure that whatever plan is coming up, it doesn't just benefit them, but it has an overall impact on the region, because doing it alone is not going to work. We've been trying that now for 30 years, and it's having slight impact, but not enough to really address the issues. So we need to move forward and do this as a community. And the last part is creating a real system of indicators, common tools that can be used so communities, no matter where they are, Southeast Asia, the Americas, Europe, Africa, they can be used to speak a common language and people can see their work done. Empower the people that they are using. Empowered people produce better results than top-down approaches. And those indicators will also give back live measurements to see the positive growth. And this, through both the second, helping link efforts and indicators, will help bridge that disconnect between communities and between people's thinking of just the present or the short-term future, the next year or so, to the long-term future, which climate change really needs to be addressed in, because this is a long-term process. We are influencing a global ecosystem, many ecosystems bridged together. So we can't just do this in a year or two. This is a long-term process and new leadership is required. So I go back to the beginning of my presentation and just say that through my work with them, the technical issues may differ from spot to spot, place to place, community to community. But the underlying bridge is utilizing new leadership methods, recognizing that this is a global issue. We are all affected by it, and working together globally through new methods of leadership. And only through that will we really start making a difference. Thank you.